So as you can probably see, we've already demasked the top half. Now what we did when we started off this job is we actually masked off the whole van for a respray before we started. We then put the poly sheet and masked the van off to the halfway point, so that when we'd put the colour down the bottom end like we've got now, we could literally cut the sheet back and then just re-mask it up at the top, and everything else was already masked up. All the door shuts, all the little bits and pieces have already been masked on the inner edge. Now once we pull that off, as you can probably tell there, we've got a very faint soft edge on there, so we'll just give this another little prep along here and along that edge all the way around with a 400 on the DA once we've got it all masked and we've got it all ready. And all we'll do is we'll use the little Swage line underneath the crease here, and we're going to use the J-tape, fine line tape, to go along that all the way along and mask that up, and then bag the bottom off with a big sheet of paper, because one big sheet of paper on these T5s will cover the whole bottom end of the van and give it a really nice big large skirt around the bottom, so that once we're done there'll be nothing that any overspray can get down to the bottom. So this is what we're going to be going through in a second. We're just going to go across the other side and I'll show you guys how we're going to fine line this off, how we'll deal with the little edges, and the process that we're going to do to mask the van up. So first things first, the things that we're going to need for this are some fine line tape. We're using the J-tape fine line tape, we're using a filler spreader and a single edge razor blade. So as I said before, we're going to use that little very slight swage line that's right on the inside of this wing, just up in that edge there. Now the way that I personally do it is to put one side on first and then to just gently stretch it across the panel and then tack it on the other end, and then you'll end up with a very nice straight edge going all the way across the panel. Now I won't lie, fine lining does take a little bit of practice, but once you've done it a couple of times you will find it very easy. So again, we're just going to hold it down with a finger on that end. We're just going to apply a light bit of tension across this. Now the good thing is with the J-tape fine line tape that most of their tapes are actually pressure sensitive, so until you actually really push this down it won't stick. So as you can see here, I'm taking this on and off a couple of times, making sure I've got that nice perfectly straight line from end to end, and if I don't feel like I have, even though the tape is touched, it won't stick until we apply pressure on it like you see me doing here. So first I'll just go across and tack it in a few areas, and then I'll stick it down all the way across. Now as I said in part 1 of this video, only around about 10 to 12% of you guys that actually watch these videos are subscribed. So please just take 2 minutes for me now, just 2 quick minutes. Pause the video, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified when we've got a new upload, and if you enjoy our videos and you enjoy our content, also give that like button a hit, and if you like or if you've got any questions, just feel free to leave a comment as well. It all helps us out in the YouTube algorithm and helps our videos get seen and get suggested more to more people across YouTube. Okay, so we've now got that line all the way across there, and we've got a nice neat line tucked up underneath there. Now it's always good to double check your ends to make sure that they're down, and if there's any little air bubbles you can just use the back of the razor blade, or the safer option would be to use the filler spreader and just tuck those little edges in. Now for the joins, we've already masked all behind the actual panels themselves, so all we're going to do is we're just going to nick right down the middle of that panel gap with the razor blade just to split the fine line tape apart, and then we're just using a filler spreader to tuck the two edges round nice and neat, so there's a nice clean crisp edge on that. Now as we apply the tape, I want to do exactly the same thing for the first layer of tape. I'm just going to nick it right down the center of that panel gap, use the filler spreader again just to tuck that in, just to stop any overspray from the top getting on those panel edges. And then what I'm doing now is I'm just wrapping a little bit of tape around the filler spreader, and then I'm going to put that in now as like a little sealing pocket into this edge, so that when we put the paper around the whole bottom of the van to create the skirt, this will give us a nice sealed edge to stop any overspray blowing out from in there and getting on any of the bottom of the panels. Now if a tiny little bit did, it wouldn't be too much of an issue, because as we're going to flat and polish the van, or you know, if you got a tiny bit of overspray down there, you can very lightly run the buffer over it. But we just do that just as a little bit of extra added protection, just to stop the paint or any overspray getting on the bottom half. So as you can see, the way that we mask this off, it makes masking off the bottom half of this now with a nice big paper skirt. Very clean, very quick and very simple. Literally one piece of paper around the bottom of this now will now completely mask off the whole bottom end of this van, because we've got it all pre-masked and pre-lined out ready. So it makes it extremely quick, extremely efficient, and paper itself is very cheap. Now the next thing that we need to deal with is obviously this edge. Now I know a lot of people always have a go at a sand in the booth, but this is the tiniest amount of sanding, and if you make sure that you keep good housekeeping and you go around and you clean all this van down and blow it all off, obviously with it being a two-stage paint job, there's always going to be a little dust or something in there anyway, and as long as you go around and just make sure that everything's alright, then just running a quick bit of 400 over there is not going to cause any harm in the booth. And with this being a proper booth, obviously you get the airline around this van, the airflow in this booth is huge, and it will suck any remaining dust right out through those filters at the back of the spray booth. Now on the underside, where we've got that fine line tape, what we're going to do is we've got a nice fresh piece of red Scotch-Brite, and we're going to give that a real good thorough scotch all the way along that bottom edge to make sure that everything really is keyed up really well against that fine line tape, so we end up with a nice clean crisp edge. So we've put a little bit of soft foam that we've rolled up and put inside the door handles. We've checked all the masking, we've got all the bottom end masked up, so now we're going to give this thing a complete closed coat of wet on wet primer. Now obviously before we mixed up this primer, we went round, we cleaned all the van off, we've given it another panel wipe, we've given it another tack rag, we've got a paint suit on, we've got gloves on, and then I've mixed up some wet on wet primer. So this is my high build that I use, that I've mixed 4 to 1 with 30% thinners in it, and I've set my gun up as if I was putting top coat on, hence I'm using my top coat gun, so I can get a nice smooth lay down on this coat. And I literally want to try my best to aim really for one even wet coat, and I want to make sure that everything is nice and sealed. Now on a job like this where it's got quite a lot of rub throughs, because in its life it's had quite a bit of paint work, this van, I would rather give it a coat of wet on wet to seal everything up, or for our American viewers, what we would call wet on wet would be the equivalent of your sealer. It will help stop any paint reaction anywhere, and also with all this being a silver van, this coat of wet on wet primer will seal up all our sanding scratches and leave us with a nice smooth even layer to lay down the metallic silver. And the silver that we're using for this is the Volkswagen Reflex silver. It's quite a nice silver, and it's the standard silver off these vans. Now as you can see, I'm just concentrating on that one nice even coat of wet on wet primer. I don't want to go too heavy, but I also don't want to go too light. I just want one smooth even coat. Now I've left so much of this coat in for you guys, but I don't want to show the whole coat, because obviously in a second we're going to be getting around to the base coat and the clear coat stage on this van, so I wanted to make sure that we could get a little bit of all three on the top half of this van into this part 2 video for you guys. So in a second we're just going to finish up this coat on these back doors, and you can tell that I'm going around, I'm taking my time, I'm just making sure I've got a nice even wet coverage over everything, and that includes in a minute getting on top of the spoiler on a little set of steps, making sure that's got a nice even wet coat on top, and this will just help seal down all these panel edges. There's quite a lot of rub throughs on this, because especially the top half of this van, it was quite extensive in the amount of prep work that it needed, because it had quite a bit of rough paint in its life. There's quite a lot of chips, there's quite a lot of issues with this spoiler, and absolutely all sorts of things on this van. So we want to give this a really good prep, and then give it a nice coat of wet on wet just to seal all these edges and seal all our everything that we've done prep wise right down before we start shooting the silver. So it's not often I do this actually, but for the silver I've ended up using my DVR clear for this. It's not a massive area on top of this, so there's not really any areas that I'm going to be worrying about any mottling or anything like that. And we're using a solvent base coat, and it's mixed 2-to-1 with medium thinners. I didn't want to go for a slow because I didn't want to risk any reaction over the wet and wet primer, and I didn't want to use a fast because I did have the booth cranked up again on this day to about 26 degrees just to help with flash off times, especially with the wet and wet primer. Now, in between the wet and wet primer stage and putting the base coat on, I did give this around about half an hour with the booth going and let this flash off nicely and dry down. We then tack ragged it off before we started applying the silver. So for the silver, I am just going to give this I'd say 2.5 wet coats, but it pretty much ended up I just went straight around this van back to back with 3 wet coats around this top end. I wanted to make sure there was plenty of colour on there, that everything was nice and covered and nice and even, and because we're not sort of spraying a massive area on the sides of this van, there was no worrying about sort of mottling or anything like that. So I could just go over, rather than 2 full wet coats and then a drop coat, we just gave this 3 full wet coats. And at the end of it, everything looked absolutely spot on. It was nice and even, but we didn't have to put anything down too wet to risk any reactions or anything like that with the wet on wet or any of the other work that's been done to the van. So at 3 coats, it gave me a nice little way of going around it. And as I said, because we use solvent for this job rather than using water like we normally do, it gave me a lot less time in the booth. It meant I could literally go around with 1 coat, go around with the 2nd coat, and then go straight around it with the 3rd coat. So with this 3rd coat, we're more trying to make sure that we've just got everything 100% covered in our minds. All these little edges and all these little grooves are well coloured. There's plenty of colour up on top there where we're stretching a little bit. And also to make sure that there's a nice even metallic laydown all over this top end. Now, if it was a slightly larger area, or I was doing, say, a repair to this, then I probably would do this in 2 full wet coats and then do a drop coat all around it, or a dust coat, whichever you prefer to call it, or an effect coat. But in this case, the way that I wanted to do this was just go around with 3 full wet coats, give this a real nice even coverage and get plenty of colour on there to make sure that there was nothing anywhere on this van that looked out of place once it was all painted up. Now, once I'd completed the full coat, I went round, I'd just denib any little areas that looked like they were, say, a few little dust specks that were a little bit too large, because on a job like this where you've got so many window gaps and so many panel gaps and stuff like that, there is the odd little chance that a little bit of dust that's a little bit too big will come out, and it will obviously leave a little bit of a mark in the colour, especially on a silver like this. So once I'd finished this coat, I'd go around, just double check there was no denibbing to do. If there was any little bits that I needed to denib, I'd just give them a light coat over with the spray gun again, just those in those areas that have denibbed it, just to make sure that the denibbing marks were out, those areas were nice. Would then go out, mix up some clear coat, give this a little bit of time to flash off in the booth while we were doing that and while we were cleaning the spray gun out, so we could come back in fresh and obviously re-tack the whole top end of this van down before we started putting any clear coat near it, and just give it a final check over by eye before we start shooting the 2K clear down. Okay, so on to the stage that I know most of you guys love to see. So we're on to the clear coat stage. So I'm using my Sagola 4600 DVR clear in a 1.3 XL setup. This is by far my spray gun for choice for clear coat. We've got the Meeper CC9 clear coat for this job that we're using in 2 full wet coats, and I've just put around about 5% slow thinners into it, just to help it flash off and flow out that little bit better with the extra heat that I've got in the booth today. So with this, I'm going around about a 50% overlap on the first coat, and then we're going to give this around about a 10-minute flash off in between coats, and then we're going to come back in and we're going to hit the second coat on there. So for the first coat, I'm running this around about 2 to 2.5 turns out on the fluid. I'm running a full fan and I'm running 2 bar of air pressure, which for me is pretty much the sweet spot with this spray gun and with this clear coat. Now on the second coat, we're going to turn the fluid out a little bit more. We're going to keep the pressure the same, and then we're just going to get that extra bit of fluid down there and then really wet this up. Now, awkward parts on these vans, and normally we don't do them with the spoilers attached, but this van came in and it had already had the spoiler and everything fitted. So around those little areas like that, you just want to be extra careful. Just feather your trigger slightly so you're not putting as much clear coat where you don't want it. Pay attention to where your clear coat is landing under areas like that, because it's really easy, especially on these T5s where you've got quite a lot of swage lines and different swage lines heading in different areas. We've got to get underneath the spoiler, we've got to get the flat face at the back of the tailgate. Just take your time on this first coat and go around them and just wet them up nice and gently. And then on the second coat, you can go, once you've got something there to grip to, you can go that little bit wetter and that little bit quicker. I wouldn't say without as much care. You still need to be as accurate as where you're putting the clear coat down, but you just need to take your time that little bit on this first coat, because this first coat really is what everything, it's like all the groundwork for the second finish coat to stick to. So take your time, don't rush. If you do end up with a slightly little bit of a dry area anywhere, it's not really going to matter all that much. You know, some people put a first coat down, they go around it and think, oh, you know, it's a tiny little bit dry there. Well, at the end of the day, that's why we're going around this thing with 2 full wet coats. And 2 full wet coats with next to no reducer in this will leave us a really nice, good, thick build of clear coat on here. So we'll have that little bit to flatten polish off, the same as we will do the bottom, and we'll still have a nice deep gloss on there as well. Now you can see, even though I'm running quite conservative settings on this gun, it's not running slow. The 1.3 XL tip on this gun is suited more towards a quicker painter, I'd say, but by turning the fluid down that little bit, you can slow this gun down. So don't let the speed that I'm going around this van with this spray gun put you off if you are looking towards one of these guns and you're thinking it's a little bit too quick, because I find that although this is a quick gun, it's also a very easy to control spray gun, which is why I really like it. So I've gone out and mixed my second coat up. I'm just coming in, just doing a little bit of a tack test to make sure that it's ready for the second coat. Now what that wants to feel like is basically like you're putting your fingers on the back of a piece of the adhesive on some masking tape. You want the clear coat to be tacky and stick and be sticky, but you don't want it to come off on your glove. At that point, for me, that is the ideal time to hit a nice real wet second coat on a panel, because it's almost like putting, you know, 2 sticky pieces of masking tape together. Now we've got the really sticky side that's on the van, and then we've got the second sticky side now that we're spraying on, so everything can lay down a little bit wetter. It'll reduce the chance of getting any sags or runs, which I have to say, on this one, I think there's a tiny little sag underneath one of those little bowls on the door handles, and for how wet I was putting it down, I'll be honest with you, I was quite surprised it didn't come out with 1 or 2 little bits like that. But there's just that one tiny little sag underneath, and that's no issue. It took me like 2 minutes with a little block to get rid of that, because no matter how perfect you guys think we are watching these videos, we all do get runs, we all do get sags, we all do get issues and redos. It's just part of being a painter and pushing the limits of the products that we're using. We're always, you know, when I get a new clear coat, I'm always trying to push it as far as I can to try and get the best finish that I can with it. But there's always a limit to how far your product or your spray gun can go. And the only way that you figure out where that limit is by pushing it to its limit, and it'll get to the point where it does run or sag, and then you know that's as far as that product can go. And knowing your materials in that respect can make you quite a lot better as a painter. If you take the time to get used to the materials and say like the clear coats that you're using, you know when you go to a job that if your booth's nice and warm, or if it's a cold day, you know you can push it further or you can't push it as far. And also having confidence in the products that you're using, and also the guns and the equipment that you're using, can also make a big difference to your confidence as a painter. I know, you know, a long time ago you say, oh, you know, you can never be a good painter unless you get a good spray gun. Now, we proved that wrong when we did the £10 Amazon spray gun review, and that's the whole point of why I did that spray gun review, because I used to get a lot of comments saying, oh, well, it's all fine and well that you can paint that well when you're using a £400 or £500 spray gun. Yes, a £400 or £500 spray gun is great, and it does give you the confidence to put out jobs like this, and it means that I can put out jobs like this all day, every day, effortlessly, and never have to worry about the quality of my spray gun affecting it. However, there is, you know, spray guns out there for a lot less money, and you can put out a job just as good. Now, the gun might not last as long. You won't be using it all day, every day like we do in the shop, because it just won't last. They're not built to last like that. But having a spray gun like this, using a good quality clear coat from a good manufacturer like sort of Mipra or Roberlo or any of the others that are out there that make, you know, really nice high-end clears, it does give you the confidence that when you come to do a job like this, that you know what you're doing, you know how to paint. So you've got a good gun in your hand, you've got quality clear coat in there, you can just go in, relax, and I find that is the best time to put out your best work. When you go into the spray booth, you don't overthink it, you just chill out, put the paint in the gun, and just do what you do best, and just get in there and paint, you know, a car or a van or whatever it might be. So we are nearing now the end of part 2 on this van. On part 3 we're going to go through a few of the parts and a few other bits and pieces for this van. So before we leave part 2, let's just take a look at how this turned out. As you can see, everything's nice, crisp, clean, even. We've got a really nice wet coat of clear coat all the way around this, and it's looking absolutely spot on as far as I'm concerned, and I am really happy with how this job turned out off the gun. But we are still going to give it a little bit of a polish because it is that little bit of a custom look to this van. So that's it for part 2, guys. As you can see now, the shell is pretty much finished. We've just got to flatten polish on that. So in part 3 we're going to get onto all the parts, get them done, and get everything bolted back up and get it all flat and polished up. So hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, don't forget to like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell as well so be notified of when we've got a new upload. That's it for me for today, so I'll see you again soon.